the body of the distribution, like noise, what matters is information comes from extreme events. So let's and you cannot really talk about one without talking about the other, because that's right. So let me start with past dependence and irreversibility. Okay, you have the illusion that life is about cost-benefit analysis. The condition under which cost-benefit analysis works is absence of ruin, absence of some kind of event that's irreversible. And that applies both to individuals and, of course, to the collective, more so for the collective. So if you have 100 people go to a casino, which is the way typically we study expected value, expected return, or cost-benefit analysis, on one day, you get a different average from if you send one person to a casino for 100 days. Because if a person is ruined on day, say, 20, the game is over for that person. And you invariably will hit a ruin. So this is where, we focus on ruin probabilities by saying that, if you play Russian roulette and lose, you won't have a chance to come back. So.
Oh, really? Oh, that's very sweet. That's very sweet.
Sorry,
It's very technical.
Yeah, this is Galia. Right. Sorry. Yeah. Okay. So this is the ergodicity. So this is a something that is discussed in a few places, but if you Google I think an article called "The Logic of Risk Taking," it's on Medium. And it's a chapter of my latest book, Skin in the Game, my latest non-technical book, Skin in the Game. And also you can Google the non-naive precautionary principle I did with Yanir and a bunch of people. So for us, for example, a nuclear risk is not really something part of that department. It is risky. Nuclear is very risky, but it's not multiplicative. A pandemic is multiplicative. See, the fact that if something detonates at Chernobyl, it doesn't cause another thing to explode in Chile. So that's where there's a difference between classes of risk, and we are concerned with things that are multiplicative. And things that are multiplicative are fat-tailed. So to give you an example, we started fighting, Yanir, myself, and a bunch of other people, especially Yanir and myself, the thinkers around Ebola, because they could not get that you cannot compare naive statistics of Ebola, which has fat tails and is multiplicative, to people drowning in their bathtub. You see, so people are telling us, listen, maybe one American died of Ebola. That was when we were fighting for Ebola. 3,000 people drown in the bathtub every year. Well, think about it. If I drown in my bathtub, the odds of Yanir drowning in his bathtub hasn't changed. But if I die of Ebola, the odds of my neighbor, of other people, including Yanir, dying of Ebola have increased. So this is the difference between things that are multiplicative and have completely different properties and cannot be compared to things that are not multiplicative. So there are two axes. One is precautionary principle. In other words, make sure that you can come back. You take risk, but you want to come back from these risks. So non-absorbing barrier, non-path dependence. That's one idea. And the second one is a classification of risks and threats into things that are multiplicative and fat-tailed and things that are not. So on January of last year, January 2020, during January 2020, I think it was the 20th or 21st of January, we started to explain that we had to worry about COVID because it was multiplicative. And we faced, at the time, it's very interesting. Now intellectuals are in favor of drastic measures against COVID, but it was the intellectuals who attacked us in January 2020. It was they said, well, you're worrying about risks and are not killing that many people. You should worry about things that matter, like smoking and stuff like that. Okay. Someone just asked if you have problem with, raise your hand if you have problem with my volume, or it's probably from the end of the person who complained. Okay. So this is where we are. So January 2020, we started fighting. And again, I'm not talking zero COVID because I am not, we're not there yet. We're just into the argument, the central argument that there are some risks that we should eradicate. So March 2020, we published a paper in Nature Physics showing effectively that pandemics, all pandemics, we cataloged all pandemics in history, have this fat tail property. And the second point is that we call it the dog wagging the tail wagging the dog, that you have to worry about clipping the tail, the extreme event, not worry about the body distribution. And the way you clip it visibly is by eliminating super spreaders, making sure the thing doesn't spread. So if you want to turn COVID into something like heart attacks are not contagious, you have to make it less contagious. And how do you make it less contagious? The old-fashioned way. And what's the old-fashioned way? It was called lazarettos, quarantine, when the Habsburg, for example, had a border with the Ottoman Empire, and to go from one to the other, you had 7 days in each direction of quarantine, for example. That reduced transmission. And what we were plagued with in 2020 is the lack of understanding of the structure of the modern world. To give you an example, the Great Plague traveled slowly. There were hardly any super spreader event outside the Silk Road and Mediterranean ports. And they understood how to, slow down that explosion of the disease. But in January 20, for example, during the first few months of 2020, you had conferences. There's one in Corsica, and all you need is one conference, gathering people from 20 countries. Effectively, there are conferences in Las Vegas that bring people from 140 countries, 30,000 doctors, for example. So one or two conferences like these are sufficient to doom the planet. So to clip the tail, and if the job is to clip the tail, make sure the thing doesn't explode, you have to focus first on these things. I remember Yanir trying to lobby the State Department, trying to talk with the State Department during the Ebola days by explaining to them that if you let one person leave Gabon, which at the time was the place where Ebola was coming from, you leave Gabon to go to Paris, for example, and then, of course, from Paris, you travel places. By the end of about 24 hours later, you've infected 2,800, potentially infected 2,800 people. Whereas in the past, these diseases did not have these properties. So then we started looking for measures that are not very costly, but extremely effective to clip the tail, to clip the explosion. And of course, it was a waste of time. I think only Asian countries only Asian countries managed to do that. No, Yanir, it was what China managed to understand immediately, that you need to reduce mobility. And then other Asian countries followed. And Taiwan, for example, had almost like an air bridge to Wuhan, a lot of flights, but yet managed to not get infection. So it doesn't take much. It just takes, whereas in the United States, it took another 13 months before the federal government, imposed a PCR at the border, or mandated PCRs to fly into the United States. I'm talking about February 2021, after Biden came to office. So you realize that we're spending a lot of money. It's not like we're not spending money on this. We're spending tons of money on supporting, you know how we're spending money, just with the easing by the Federal Reserve, but nobody's thinking of the easiest solution, which number one is overactive testing. So we have economies that spend, I don't know how much on nuclear submarines, okay, and how much on Star Wars, but then you can't really produce a cheap test that's readily available. So so that was the story. So I'm giving a little bit of background about our work in there, and we published, of course, in some journals. We started fighting for masks in March of 2020 by figuring out that there's a flaw in the logic in people who oppose masks, aside from absence of evidence not being evidence of absence, to say, well, there's no evidence that masks work. But there's no evidence, that a lot of things work, but that we use them. But the point is, you don't wait for the evidence, to protect yourself. There's no evidence I may have an accident today, yet I will have a seatbelt later on. Anyway, so the second point, people don't understand the nonlinearity involved with masks. Like if I reduce the viral load by 20%, I may reduce the infection rate by 90%. There's nonlinearity. And then the second point, if I wear a mask and the other person wears a mask, the probability is compound. So there are a lot of things that were missing in the discourse that we started introducing. And then we published about 3 papers in stat journals. One in the medical journal just came out on masks after a year of fighting people on Twitter. and then the Nature of Physics thing. And then our first January 20th warning. One more thing I would say about the thing that's still not understood. People are getting some points that the people still don't get. It's the following: is that the risk for an individual doesn't aggregate, to the risk of a collective. So to give you an idea, okay, if I individually, all right, have a higher risk of dying in a car crash than dying from COVID, collectively, you see the probability of 1,000 people dying from COVID is higher than the probability of 1,000 people dying from a car crash over the next period. But people don't understand that the things don't aggregate properly, and there are a lot of error in the reasoning. So my fight in COVID was based on both risk management rules and also trying to introduce sound, clarity of thinking in the way people fail to get scaling. And my connection with Yanir came from complex systems and scaling. So that I think I'm done, Yanir. I've introduced the point. And now we can disagree, because I have one more point. I would like zero COVID, but my background is a trader, and I want compliance. Okay, you want to figure out what you're not going to get zero COVID. Why can you get zero COVID? Because you'll have pushback. The harder you try in one direction, the more pushback. I mean, I'm now in Atlanta, in the South, and when I compare it to New York, I realize New Yorkers have some kind of social conscience here. Whatever the government tells them, they want to do the opposite.
Yeah.
So you have a pushback because of this father problem a lot of people have with the government. If the government tells you something in many states, in many communities, then suddenly the people rebel, and effectively the government was wrong. We think that's the wrong thing in the beginning of COVID.
Yeah. Let me get into a couple of things, because I know that you want to create some interesting dialogue, but I want to start actually by talking about something else, the tendency to think about variables separately, one for the other, and not how they combine. And an example of this is that there were a bunch of epidemiological papers that basically came to the conclusions that travel restrictions wouldn't help. The reason why they came to this conclusion was that they say, well, if we impose travel restrictions, let's say there's 1% leakage, which is an assumption, of course. But let's say that there's 1% leakage, then it'll just take, several cycles of transmission, and you'll end up back where you were. But what they're doing is they're analyzing that action independently of other actions that you can take. And if you combine them, it's like saying, I'm going to model what happens with a car if I just have a gas and brakes, but I don't have steering. Or if I use steering, but I don't use gas and brakes. So you can't drive a car without combining both steering and gas and brakes. And so the point of this separation of things and not thinking about things together isn't just when you go to collective, it's also when you have just two different dimensions. When people think as, they evaluate one thing at one time and another thing at another time,
So
and
that's
talk about how they combine, they miss the most important points.
Yeah, I mean, you have a lot of things that are missing. Epidemiology, I mean, I'm sure we have epidemiologists in the room, but epidemiology is quite disappointing at two levels. The first one is, of course, the lack of understanding of tail, of the basic fat tail distribution, because they take classes in standard statistics.
That's right.
Where you have the law of large number operating quickly. That's sort of like my specialty is making fun of people who use the wrong. I mean, standard statistics work very well in many domains, not when you talk about aggregates.
Right.
Something to cite Yanir is Yanir said when you see a doctor for N of 1, that it's clinical knowledge, all right? When you do a study for N of 100, okay, it is for N equal 100, it becomes statistical knowledge. But for N of billion, it becomes tail risk properties, and the three of them don't overlap.
Right.
See? So if you want to administer a drug to people and you want to see the effect, of course, clinical knowledge becomes an anecdote, but when you go to it's no longer even statistical knowledge, it's tail risk knowledge, complete different mathematics, complete different. And we're trying to get involved, and that's sort of like my life's mission. Is tail risk is a different business. This is what I tell people. A different discipline, a different logic, different rules, different scaling. And we've written a lot about it. And so the idea that epidemiologists cannot be trusted with many things it holds, because they don't get the tail unless they use the right mathematics, and they don't, or we haven't seen. And the second point is, I remember a common friend of ours, Yanir and myself, Stephen Wolfram, his son and a fellow called Diego here in Atlanta managed to nail down a cellular automata model, okay, in one afternoon, cellular automata model of transmission, where you actually tag individuals. You have 300-some million people in the United States in regions, and you tag individuals and see. And the results were along the lines that Yanir is saying. You get dramatically different results when you use automata than when you use modeling. And they claimed that they used automata, but they were drowned in I think 18,000 lines of code.
Right.
It was too archaic.
We now have an example that's actually going on of elimination, very close to elimination in India. And the situation in India is using something that I think, Nassim, you would appreciate. It's using a competition between villages, between communities, in order to motivate people to achieve elimination. It's localism in its correct form. And it's being successful. Not to mention that they also have a puppet show for children that's teaching kids how to deal with a pandemic, which is absolutely amazing. But the main thing is that they have this competition, which is a very mild competition, but it just points people in the right direction and it motivates shared community effort. And I've never thought of pandemic response as being a government response. It's really a community response. So the challenge that we face is I've never seen our challenge as being telling the government to act. What I've always seen is the challenge as being and ensuring that the community understands that it's their action that enables them to control this pandemic. And that's why I don't think that this one is over. And it's because, as long as it takes us, we will be suffering from this pandemic. And as soon as people realize that there really is just an opportunity in a fairly short period of time to get rid of it for themselves, it's nothing to do with the government. It's the fact that they want to get rid of this. And one of the challenges that we've faced in the United States and many other places is that the press has been amplifying the message that that there are these extremes. And now we've had a change. And this is super important. There's been CNN reports, there have been local reports on Fox, on other stations all around the country in the US that are making it clear that the majority, 70%, 80%, whatever the number is, are actually in favor of taking actions to prevent transmission. And once the press starts saying that, because people don't know, they look at their neighbors and they don't know their neighbors today. So that what they do is they listen to the press. And as long as the press is saying there are all of these extreme guys out there and this is what they're saying, then they think that they don't have a chance to do what they really want to do. So the silent majority business has got to stop. And that's happening. And I'm very impressed by the shift recently, that people are realizing that it's the vast majority of people that actually want to get rid of this. And then they can be empowered to do it. And so it's not a government action at all. Go ahead.
I don't know. The one thing, note on this is that effectively, after this pandemic is over, is when our work will start. Okay, to make sure that there is preparation for the next pandemic. Absolutely. I introduced Yanir to someone. I was sort of obsessing over pandemics from when I wrote The Black Swan, because of multiplicative effects are a lot faster than they were during past pandemics. But we didn't have the data then. The data came later. We had the intuition that it was very fat-tailed. Effectively, it's the most fat-tailed variable. And in terms of like small number of events killed the largest number of people. And then I introduced Yanir to a fellow who contacted me from Singapore.
Yep.
And he was head of civil service. He effectively ran the place. I don't know what he's doing now, introducing to Yanir. And he was, after SARS, thinking of the next pandemic.
Yep.
And boy, were they prepared? They were prepared. He was prepared. He knew exactly. It's sort of like the Roman army preparing before the battle. So you must have no surprise. And you want to have a surprise before, not after. He said, we're going to have no surprise when the pandemic comes. He didn't say if.
The Singapore community has done, comparatively speaking to many places, much better. There have been some challenges there too. And I think that one of the things that I've learned throughout the pandemic is that there is, in addition to having communities involved and members of communities who really need to be on board in terms of what's done, is that different places have learned different capabilities. And so mass testing has been done in some places and not in others. And effective, local, engagement is done in some places. Other places have done much better of this and other, so on. So there's a lot of lessons to be learned. And part of the opportunity that we have at the World Health Network is to connect these different communities so they can learn from each other. One of the amazing things, which doesn't make any sense, is that many countries just think that they have to discover everything by themselves and they can't learn from others.
Yeah.
And that just doesn't make any sense in the context of a global disease. It surely doesn't make sense in a global world where we can communicate with each other about how to address big problems.
I have one more comment. So from a dynamics, risk dynamics standpoint, it seems to me that instead of focusing on all these things, that an instant test, not instant, I mean, a 15-minute test sold for $1 at drugstores, and that is anonymous, would have the biggest bang for the buck.
And there is this in Europe now. They have it in Europe.
Yeah.
So let me just say something about Ebola, so that people know the background, and because we were talking about this together at the time, and people at the time were like saying, hey, we don't need any travel restrictions because hey, we'll deal with it with hospitals, and hey, the disease is going to go to burn out there and several million people will die. And those were the main predictions that people made. And they were both fundamentally wrong, right? The first one was wrong because it's not
People
hospitals.
know because
And the second one was wrong because it's not you can stop diseases, and it was stopped with it not with millions of people dead, but with 11,310 people dead. So I learned not to respect many people's predictions and to recognize that communities can make decisions and get things done. So I hope that we will learn that lesson. Nassim, it's been tremendous
Thank you.
and a pleasure for us to have you here and for all the collaborations over the years. And I'm looking forward to more. And I hope that indeed we will successfully defeat this outbreak and not just drag it into the next one.